All right. Hello, Ben.
Hi, Leslie. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's really nice to see you. And thanks for being here.
Hmm.
I'm here with Ben Harris. And Ben, would you mind giving a little introduction for yourself and let people know what your background is?
Yep, sure, I certainly will. Well, I'm a psychotherapist. I guess I've been practicing for uh, not a vast amount of time, best part of a decade, I suppose now. Don't know where the time goes, really. And I practice in London and the Channel Islands, British Channel Islands. And I do work online as well, further afield. Before I was a psychotherapist, I used to work in the City of London as an analyst and then a lawyer. So I've kind of had a bit of a journey, I suppose, to get to where I am now.
Well, that's an
Uh,
interesting trajectory from law to therapy.
I know a couple of other people who've done it, but I think it's not it's not that common. I think the skills are quite different. So there's not a I would say there's not a vast amount of transferable skills from law to psychotherapy, but that's good in a way, right? You can teach an old dog new tricks.
Well, it's interesting. I was in law school when I decided I wanted to instead switch tracks and go into counseling.
So you actually, I can add you to my list of people who moved in that direction. My
Yeah,
small list.
just a similar flavor anyway. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
interesting.
So, Ben, you are a contributing author to the new book, the new CTA book. Would you kind of give a little bit of an overview of that project and talk a little bit about your contribution to it?
Certainly, I will. So I think this is quite an important project, actually. Without wanting to, blow our own trumpets. I think initially the genesis of this was a little while ago now. So a few people in the psychology and therapy sphere were starting to write articles online about some of the negative influences of critical social justice in the therapy sphere. Uh, this sort of ideologizing of therapy, if you like. Um, and therapy, I would say, is an avowedly non-ideological activity. Uh, Although, I've had some interesting conversations about that with some of my more woke clients, actually. But it's always interesting to have these discussions. But I have been concerned about this for some time. I remember I initially started paying attention to an unknown Canadian psychology professor called Jordan Hughes, uh, a while ago, whilst I was training, actually. And I remember reading all this stuff about that he might be sort of struck off from practice and sort of lose his job at I think it's Toronto University, wasn't it, for not having a sort of a critical gender theory approach to sex and gender. And I just remember thinking at the time, wow, that seems pretty mad to me, actually, pretty strange,
Mhm.
because I thought we lived in a sort of broadly liberal polity where people were entitled to disagree and have different opinions and actually could disagree well. Because I think actually knowing how to just disagree well is a very important skill, actually.
Mhm.
Um, but that was I felt a little bit of a canary in a coal mine, and obviously I've got a British experience which is different to yours, but really since about 2015, 16, I've been observing the cultural shifts, and I've been very concerned by the increasing authoritarianism, as I would see it, that is developing in our cultures, particularly, I would say, in Western Anglophone countries. I'm not qualified to speak so much about continental Europe, but certainly I think in English-speaking countries, there's an increasing authoritarianism, I would say. And as a therapist, well, as a trainee and then a therapist, I was sort of thinking about this, and it didn't particularly impact me in my training. Thankfully, we had a diversity module, which was very open. And indeed, I remember actually our diversity tutor invited the group to think about what it might be like to be a conservative in
Oh,
the group.
wow.
And
So
I think
actual diversity of viewpoint, not just.
absolutely, and I
Mm,
think things have changed a bit.
mm,
I think things have changed a bit since then. So I saw an article by Val Thomas published on James Lindsay's New Discourses site,
mhm.
and Val actually had been a trainer at my institute, so I knew her very distantly. And I sent her an email to say it's really good to see you making some of these points, which I think need to be made. Well done. Kind of put a few of my thoughts in there about it, and she well, we had a little exchange, and then she asked me to if I would consider contributing a chapter to this book that she was putting together. So that's how that came about for me.
Mhm.
And as you may be aware, it just got published a couple of weeks ago. It's been a bit of a delay because this project initially started in 2021, I think. So we're a little bit sort of down the line now, but my goodness, everything it says is still as relevant today as it would have been a year or two ago.
And the book is entitled Cynical Therapies.
The book is entitled Cynical Therapies, a little
Mhm.
play on cynical theories, as you
Mhm.
can probably notice. It's entitled Cynical Therapies on the basis that some of these critical, social justice oriented ways of doing things, there is a certain cynicism to it. They might not actually be that therapeutically effective. And I mean, goodness me, I've read a couple of chapters from a few people, but actually having got the book a couple of weeks ago, I feel absolutely honored to be a part of the lineup, because there are some very very insightful, very thoughtful people in there. A number of them have been published before. They've had books out on other subjects.
Mhm.
Some very learned figures, and we've all come together with not the same, I wouldn't say, but sort of similar, sometimes similar, sometimes divergent sort of concerns and emphases about what we perceive going on in the therapy field.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, but it's I feel very optimistic about this project. Actually, it's a powerful book. It's got a lot of strong thinking in it, a lot of uh, it really makes you think, I suppose.
Mhm. Well, I also found Val through that same article on New Discourses.
Mm.
And I think I was in my first year of graduate school at that point, and I was really just completely surprised by what I was experiencing in school, and I was really dismayed and confused and um, sort of becoming discouraged because of the ideological tenor of the program.
Mm.
And finding her writing, it really that article, it summed up a lot of my concerns, and it articulated them in a way that I hadn't been able to, because I was still trying to sort of parse this and understand
Mm.
what was even happening. And here she came in with this perspective which really illuminated the scope of this, and why it was so wrong to be
Mm.
injecting these ideas into the counseling sphere. And I felt understood. I mean, I immediately
Mm.
reached out to her, and that's how I um, first found CTA. It was like a beacon for me at that point, because it was such a reality check. Like, no, I'm not crazy. This really is happening. And
Mm.
yeah, it was great. So I'm so glad there's more people coming together and putting this information out, it's got to be so encouraging for people coming across this, especially students who are entering this field at this time.
Yes, and I think it's I think it's an intimidating field to be entering if you are not an orthodox thinker. If your thinking kind of aligns you towards curiosity, heterodoxy, thinking around ideas, that traditionally would have been a great kind of useful starting point for a therapist. But I think these days there's maybe a sense that actually that's not quite so welcome. Now,
isn't that strange though, as you say that, that those characteristics, curiosity, heterodoxy, I mean, the ability to think around ideas, those examples are exactly what you'd want with somebody who's going to be making their job sitting with different individuals and being open to different worldviews all day long.
You would
I'm
think
struck
so,
by
wouldn't
that.
you?
Yes.
Yes, it is a remarkable thing, which is why I think I also found CTA quite a beacon. And I think what I like about it, particularly, is it is a different focus. So a lot of what I think it's very easy to get, wrapped up in a kind of culture war kind of dynamic, which is broadly political, broadly ideological, I would say. And what's great about CTA, what's important about this book, I think, is that this book is not a political book, right? All of the contributors, we've got different political commitments, no political commitments. It's not about politics. This could also apply to any ideology, by the way, right? So although CSJ is the danger to therapy at the moment, actually this could equally apply to a different ideology, to a kind of right-wing nationalist ideology, for instance. This book is about what happens when you systematically squash, kind of push down and crush the spiritual and psychological and ethical aspects of what it is to do therapy, right? Because our job is fundamentally to help people grow, right? That's how I would see it. Therapy, we bring different kind of skills to that, right? Some people are person-centered, some people are more psychoanalytic. I'm more that. I'm less person-centered. My practice is sort of mixture of psychoanalysis, existentialism, and some Jungianism. So I'm trained integratively. But different people come at it from their CBT, of course, much more structured. So different people are coming at it from different angles. But the basic idea is pretty clear, actually. The initial goal is to help people heal, then is to help them grow. And what bringing ideology into therapy does is it guts that. It rips that out. It rips the heart out of therapy, right? Because what you end up with is a scenario where you are teaching people to parrot orthodoxies, political orthodoxies, ideological orthodoxies. I think it was the French Marxist, who was it? It was Althusser, I think, who talked about the fact that ideology is always a justification for power, right? And how do you maintain power? How do you solidify power? You do it by deciding what the discourse is and what the acceptable realms of inquiry are and what the answers are. So there are no unknown questions and there are no unknown answers. All the questions and all the answers are known in advance. And that is fundamentally antithetical to what therapy is about. Because every therapeutic experience with a new client, of course, there are similarities and there are patterns, but every new experience with a new client That's a new becoming. That's a new engagement. That's a new experience. And if you if you think it's the kind of therapist's job to sit in front of the client and kind of tell them what their concerns are and what their problems are, oh, you're coming because you feel like there's no meaning in your life and your marriage is breaking down and you're wondering what you've done with the last 10 years. Oh, well, I've got a prescription for that. And that's to do with oppressive hegemony in society. It just doesn't help. So there's a real need for this book, and there's some great people in here, by the way. There's some great chapters on examining kind of CSJ as a kind of through a kind of religious kind of perspective, sort of a God-shaped hole through a Jungian perspective. There's a colleague of mine, great chapter on talking about and maybe this bears thinking about, actually, that actually one thing that's happening in therapy, I would say, is that we're becoming a kind of representative of the kind of the accepted mores, the accepted ideas in society. It sounds to me like you had kind of the blunt end of that experience when you were doing your training. It sounds like you were kind of basically told, well, all right, yes, there's a bit of space to ask some questions as long as we're heading in the right direction. And then after that, well, you got to get with the program. Well, that's it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that is a very good way to sum it up. And I really like the framework that you offer for all of this. And one of the things that I wanted to pick up on, I noticed you used the word prescription, and this maybe is a little bit of a tangent, but it ties into something else that you said earlier. You used the word prescription as a metaphor in that example. Here's the prescription. Let's inject some critical consciousness into the equation here. But also in a similar vein, the medicalization almost represents another ideology that I feel similarly concerned with in the therapy field. And so often we are seeing that in the literal, not metaphorical sense, that people are coming in and just receiving a prescription, not obviously from a psychotherapist or counselor usually, but when they bring these problems to a general practitioner or to their family doctor, that's been a trend as well, this trend in medicalization of mental health. And I see it almost, and again, this is tangential, but it does tie into what you said earlier about how it doesn't have to be this particular ideology. It could be any ideology. It's interfering with this concept of the self growth, the growth of the self, the individual's capacity for healing and growth. And so what do you think about that?
I have a lot of sympathy with that view, and of course you're right. That healing and self growth is, I mean, it's kind of inevitably idiosyncratic, right? Because everybody's got their own, everyone's got their own cross to bear, to use another metaphor. Everybody's got their own pain, their own suffering, and everybody needs to make their own kind of accommodation, their own compromise to the pain of the world and the pain internally, the psychodynamic conflicts of being pulled in different directions. Now, the medicalization, it's an interesting thing, is it sort of I don't even use the phrase mental health very often, actually. So I don't conceive of what I do as a medical activity or even a pseudo-medical activity. Actually, I think it's actually much more akin to a philosophical activity, a kind of a dialogue rather than a medical activity, I think. But it's got lots of different aspects to it. And, we all know that I don't have them offhand right here. I'm not really a stats guy. I'm more of a kind of big picture guy, which might be another way, of course, of saying that I'm kind of all airy-fairy. But, we all know that the number of prescriptions for, depression, anxiety, ADHD, these things are up, and they're up and up and up, and they continually go up. And, maybe people want to take a pill and feel better, right? And I'm not here to tell them they can't do that, but I am here to say it's not how I do it. And therapy is a very powerful tool because it invites us to accept the nature of reality as it is, rather than as we would like it to be, and then to grieve the fact that reality is as imperfect as it is, and then move forward in the face of that. And if you're taking a pill, it might remove your symptoms, but it doesn't give you power. And I'll tell you what gives you power, because I think therapy is about power, actually. It's about helping people build resilience and become empowered in their own lives to make their own choices. And you only really become empowered when you understand yourself and you understand the world around you, and don't see it through kind of, rose-tinted lenses. So this kind of medicalization of therapy, again, it's a kind of misconstrual of the human experience, of the human condition. It's kind of saying, oh, suffering is abnormal. Come here, I can give you a pill for that. And don't get me wrong, I would never say to a client, don't go and seek a kind of medical support if you feel you need it. I always say to people, if you feel you need it, go and have a chat with your GP. That's not my area. What we're doing here is something different. So there's different ways, different paths to healing. But I know that talking therapy is a very powerful tool, and it's unfortunately becoming blunted. It's becoming blunted by partly by this over medicalization, as you would see it, and I think I would share that perspective. But I accept that other people have sort of other views on that, but also certainly by this sort of ideologization of the I was tripping over my tongue to say that word. It's so difficult, but this sort of encroaching of ideology into the profession, because that is teaching people that the world is a certain way, right? I mean, what is the basic idea of critical social justice? It's the idea that I might actually read from my chapter, because I've got a little definition in here. Here's the book, by the way.
It's a beautiful cover.
It's a great cover, isn't it? I think it's a really, really striking and arresting one, actually. Where am I? Chapter 3. What is critical social justice? Well, this is easy for me to read this rather than trying to remember it off the top of my head. It's the idea that Western societies are fundamentally oppressive, so that all of the structures of our societies are based around maintaining the power of already existing powerful groups. So, whether it be, whites or men or cisgender people or straight people or able people, non-obese people. You can see that the pattern it kind of runs across the whole range of the fields of critical social justice, I think. So you're taught to believe that life is bleakly oppressive, essentially, and then you've got the applied calls to action. So you've got the moral requirement to believe that the world is like this, because if you don't believe that the world is bleakly oppressive, then there's something wrong with you. Then you've got to acknowledge how you yourself benefit from oppression. You've got to accept culpability for the continuation of that oppression. And then you've got to act to disrupt the structures of that oppression. There's a little definition I put in there. And of course, is the world like that? Well, maybe not. I mean, I think there's plenty of space for debate there. Probably the world is a bit like that, right? Because people like power, people like resources. It's organisms like to accrue things. They like to keep things and not have things taken from them. People prefer to climb hierarchies rather than fall to the bottom of them. That doesn't mean that hierarchies are fundamentally corrupt, of course, because let's take our profession. It's kind of somebody who's been doing it for 30 years is going to be higher up the hierarchy of competence than somebody who's been doing it for a year.
Mm-hmm.
That's just how it is. That's not a corrupt hierarchy. That's an understanding.
Organic. Yeah.
Exactly. It's organic and it's necessary. And one actually needs to understand that there are these differences, actually, because that helps. Helps you to keep a handle on some understanding why people get to where they get to sometimes. There's luck as well, of course. And luck doesn't mean it's corrupt either necessarily. It just means it's sometimes you get lucky. But I'm sure there is corruption, because people have in groups. Mm-hmm. Again, Kirsty Miller does a great chapter in the book, clinical psychologist, on talking about in groups and out groups, mm-hmm. and how they get formed through the sort of crucible of social identity theory, which is sort of not an idea from within psychotherapy, but from within clinical psychology. Very illuminating chapter. I'm slightly losing where I've gone. What was I saying? Oh, hierarchy. Yes, corruption. Yes, all right. So, it's like, yeah, people do have in groups, and racism exists, and sexism exists. And, psychoanalysts tend to be thought of as being a bit more depressive than their colleagues on the more person-centered wing of the profession. So what I would say is, human beings are pretty bad in some ways. We're pretty disreputable. We're pretty nasty to each other. Mm-hmm. Or we can be. And then kind of one of the things you want to do in your life, I would say it's an ethical imperative to understand human nature, not just as being out there, but also being in you, right? I'm not that nice. I'm also not a monster. I'm just a person, right? Mm. With various kind of attributes that are quite mixed. Some more positive, some more negative, depending on how you think about them. And, if you don't know yourself and you don't know other people, you can't really work to help people grow, to work out when they want to kind of engage in that competitive aggression, say, for instance, that helps you get places, mm-hmm. versus when they want to restrain it and mm-hmm. maybe be more cooperative. Sometimes we like doing things that don't bring us any benefit at all. Compassion is a part of the human nature as well. So we've got this very mixed nature. And critical social justice is very keen at shining the torch on the negative side, but in this very split way. So in my chapter in the book, I talk about Kleinian ideas. Melanie Klein, she was a post-Freudian sort of object relations theorist in Britain, and she talked a lot about splitting and projection. So, the idea that you split off that which is intolerable to yourself, mm-hmm. and you project it into the other. And my God, you can see critical social justice doing this in the most kind of profound and, dare I say it, florid ways. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I want to make an important point here, which is that you can hold those views and not floridly split and project, right? You can be a sophisticated critical social justice theorist, and they do exist. But there's something about the nature of the ideology and how it's grown that encourages its more kind of florid adherence. And what they do is they do something which is kind of maybe sort of intellectually sophisticated, right? So they kind of say, we got this problem, people are bad. Well, we're going to absolve the badness of non-dominant groups by saying that it doesn't really matter because it doesn't have an impact. It's only the badness of dominant groups that has an impact. Mm-hmm. And then we're going to look a bit further at these dominant groups. So let's say, one group that all these ideas appeal to is middle class and upper middle class white intellectuals, people who are quite successful, sort of near the top of the hierarchy, actually, mm-hmm. in academia, say, or the bureaucracies. And maybe they might feel a bit guilty about that. So so the kind of intellectually sophisticated thing to do is to say, well, actually, I recognize that I too am racist, or I too am sexist, or whatever it is. But because I'm aware of it, that makes me good and harmless.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, because I'm aware of it, I can do all these positive things. But look at those terrible people over there who are just like me, but they haven't acknowledged this.
Mm-hmm.
So on the surface, it looks like the person is admitting their mixed nature.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a device, right? It's like it's intellectually sophisticated, but it's psychologically incredibly naive, because they use the kind of the limited admission of their own kind of problematic nature to then project it onto the others. Well,
Mm-hmm.
okay, I am problematic, sure, but actually, basically, I'm good because I'm not as problematic as they are.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like a responsibility. It's like a buck shifting device.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And yeah, sure, that might pass as sophisticated in ideological terms and in the political arena. The political arena has never been known for, nuance or sophistication. I speak as somebody who used to be extremely political. I used to be very left wing, very involved in the Labour Party in the UK, a good comrade. But if you judge this by a nuanced understanding of human nature, through psychological mechanisms, you can see that this is a device,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a device that does what people have always done, which is take the badness, split it off, and shove it over with someone else.
Mm-hmm.
And what therapy does is the opposite. It invites us to genuinely sit with our own mixed nature, but also those of others, right? It's not about therapy is not about making yourself feel unduly guilty or making your client feel unduly guilty. It's about nuance and context. It's about helping your client understand that, yes, they do have a mixed nature. They're not perfect, but that's just like everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
It's not some kind of special weight that they're carrying individually.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, you look at some of these kind of changes in the trainings and what's coming over the profession, and all this understanding about human nature is being lost in the service of power,
Mm-hmm.
in the service of ideology. There's another chap called Nick Opirchel. I'm not sure I'm saying his surname correctly, but it's a great chapter in which he talks about how psychotherapy is becoming a part of the kind of the maybe like the Brahmin class, the kind of priest class, the kind of the administrative class that defends the elite. So, kind of maybe we have this sort of curious combination of hyper-capitalism and kind of socially progressive ideas that seems to be gaining ever more kind of dominance as a kind of the ideology we're meant to adopt in society if we want to remain in good standing and be good people. And well, looks like psychotherapy is riding along to encourage that as well. And why might that be?
Mm-hmm.
That's an interesting question.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it comes back to understanding our nature. We like power. People like power. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with that, but you have to know it, to know to weigh it up, to decide when you want to push for what you want and push for influence, and when you think, actually, power's great, money's great, influence is great, but actually there's something more important here, or as important. We all need resources. We all need to be safe. Mm-hmm. But actually, if you want to be a therapist, it really is not about imposing your own politics on your client. I've got political opinions. They've changed over the years. I wouldn't say that I had a definitive ideology, because I think they're all ideologies sort of close things down rather than open things up. But whatever my politics are, I'm not here to tell my clients that my take on the world in those terms is right. Mm-hmm. It's absurd.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I think that's you've really eloquently laid out the case against this this narrow mindset, and the splitting and projection. Absolutely. It's it's so evident in the way that they operate. And um, something that you said a little bit earlier in what you were talking about, I really liked how you said this is a philosophical engagement, this endeavor of therapy. It's more philosophical than something medical, or like this mental hygiene sort of like. I feel like that is, we've been losing the nuance of it for some time, and this just sort of fits neatly in. And one of the things that was so, I think, shocking to me about the injection of critical social justice into the therapy training is that lack of nuance and that lack of inspection of, or awareness of the the complexity of human nature, of the self and of others, and the distilling it down to these really really caricature illustrations of what a person is. And it's really stunning that this has taken hold and that it's gotten any traction whatsoever. I don't understand how it was allowed to be an exception to the way that we think about things and the way that we think about human beings. Do you have any thoughts on that? How did it sneak in and slip past all of these really intelligent and thoughtful people?
I do have some thoughts on it, but I'd also be interested in what your thoughts on it might be. And the reason I say that is because you're kind of closer to the you're more of a canary in the coal mine than I am, if that makes sense, because you've been up close to it. Now, when I did my training, it really wasn't like this. I mean, yeah, there were some people who kind of promoted sort of feminist psychoanalysis, and that's fine, right? It's like you don't expect tutors not to have a kind of a position or a commitment necessarily, but you know, and of course, somebody who's training you kind of puts it across how they see it. But there was never this sense that you had to take on board this specific way of looking at something, otherwise you're done. You weren't part of the community of the good anymore. It's like whereas you've had the opposite experience, I think. So you've sort of seen it. Do you have any thoughts about, is it because you've seen the dynamics up close and personal?
Well, I think that I mean, I have a number of thoughts around why people are drawn to this, and what makes people adopt this way of thinking, and what makes it palatable to people who are younger and being trained in this way of thinking. It really ties things up in a nice bow. For one thing, there are complex social dynamics, and as you say, it's very true that we have imbalance, we have power disparity, we have groups that are favored over other groups and have historically had more access to resources. And there are legitimate reasons why, with an historical mind, sociological, from a sociological perspective, you could pull out and you can see these social dynamics in play that could cause resentments and disparity and difficulty for disadvantaged groups. And so there's truth in this, and there's a core of legitimacy to their claims. And yes, it's something that from a sociological perspective we can describe in these more simplistic ways, because we're doing general we're describing a general pattern. It's the distillation of that down to the individual level that loses the humanity, and it becomes, as you know, as the title of the book says, cynical, because it's looking at people as less than individuals and more as like cogs in a bigger game. And that doesn't make sense for individuals, because that has never made sense for individuals. And if anybody should see that, it should be a psychologist or a psychotherapist or a counselor, somebody whose work is understanding people at the individual level. But again, I can understand why young, naive, inexperienced people would be drawn towards these explanations, because they do offer a tidy way of organizing the world and organizing your thoughts around the world. Plus, there's the temptation to apply victimhood narratives, because we all struggle, we all suffer, we all feel oppressed in certain ways. And to have somebody offer you this on a platter that, yeah, you've been wronged, and this this is why you're not more successful than you could be. And not only that, but it's that guy over there that did it, and you should feel resentful towards him. It offers you sort of an opportunity to abdicate your own power and to escape responsibility for your own needs and unfulfilled parts of self.
Mm.
So that's very tempting. And then on the other hand, it offers social credits in the form of demonstration of compassion, demonstration of sort of putting others before yourself, looking like the good
As it
guy,
appears.
as it appears, exactly, because as you
Yeah.
described, that is a way to earn capital. It's a way to earn power it is a backdoor to power by allyship or whatever. So
Oh,
yeah,
I hate that word.
I know.
Allyship.
I know. I know. There's so many of the words that I just want to put like quotes around, but so I feel like I have observations and thoughts around a lot of this, but one of the things that perplexes me is how what happened at the upper levels of education and psychology. What happened that people who were seasoned and who were experienced and who have been putting together these curricula and these trainings and have been working with people on the individual level for years and years, how did they allow this blatant disregard for all the foundational principles of what they teach? What made this an attractive enough exception that they invited it in and let it take over? And it just seems like I guess that's the big question for me, is like what corrupted their thinking to the point where we have allowed this quote cultural competency, this critical consciousness, this indoctrination system in, where it is in such stark contrast to everything the philosophy of psychology normally embodies.
Yeah, it is. I think you said something at the beginning of our discussion that I think you were talking about sort of passing the issue, and I still feel I'm doing that. It's like, and I feel it's actually perhaps it's sort of, in a way, maybe it's sort of tempting to think, oh, we've done it to death. It's like woke, anti-woke.
Yeah.
But no, I think it's really complicated, and I think there's lots of different elements to it. And I think if we want to kind of find a way back to pluralism, which might not be possible, but if we want to find a way back to pluralism, then we have to start to actually get a much more granular and nuanced understanding of it. I mean, I don't mean on the political level. I mean on the political level, but beneath politics, before politics, because this is, I think, something comes to mind is, I think Nietzsche had something to say about all this, right? He said God is dead. Brett Alderman, great chapter in the book, he's writing about CSJ is a God-shaped piece, jigsaw piece for a God-shaped whole. And Nietzsche, and as he talks a lot about Jung, what Jung thought about religion in his chapter, and I think there's a kind of Nietzsche and Jung both had a lot to say about this, because when God is dead, it seems that it doesn't mean that you stop being. It seems that it doesn't mean that you stop making irrational commitments or irrational commitments. It just means that you make different irrational commitments. So if God is dead, you stop worshiping God, but you worship something else. So every person has a God. I think that's the conclusion that I've come to. And the problem for me is that CSJ, it's just, I'm an apostate, right? Because it's not a good enough God for me. It's a big crap. Sorry, shouldn't swear on your
no, that's okay.
It's just not. it's going to sound like a frivolous thing to say, actually, but I'm going to say it anyway. One of the things I hate most about this ideology kind of coming into therapy is that therapy is a thing of beauty. It's really messy and complicated, but it's very beautiful. It's a well-crafted, albeit messily crafted thing. And, you know, critical theory and the kind of the sort of the Marxism from which it ultimately kind of emerges. Well, maybe let's say Marxism because that's interesting. I think Marx had a few interesting things to say, actually. But critical theory, as it becomes applied in the world, it's a kind of, it's very, very ugly, and it's very, very stupid. Mm-hmm. And it sounds funny to have an aesthetic objection, but I do, because I think beauty matters in life. And everything shouldn't be ugly, and everything shouldn't be stupid. And, you know, I suppose I'm sort of implying that I think I'm sort of, you know, clever. Maybe I suppose I am implying that. You know, other people can form their own conclusions. They can agree or disagree. Mm-hmm. I don't think I'm some. This is the other thing. I don't think I'm some great intellectual, right? We got various people in this book who've been published previously. I haven't had anything published previously because, yeah, sure, I'm a good therapist. I mean, so I think. I'm a good enough therapist, but I'm a therapist, right? It's like what I do is, it's individual, but it's also derivative. It's like I take the ideas of these great practitioners and I find my own synthesis of it, and then I kind of offer it to clients. And it's partly intellectual, it's partly embodied, and it's partly cognitive, and it's partly intuitive. It's obviously loads of things going on. But it's like, I'm not some great intellectual. In fact, I would say since becoming a therapist, I've become less intellectual because I've become more attuned to the embodied and the intuitive, and less focused on the cognitive, sort of ordered, structured world of the mind. But I've got enough of that still up there from, you know, former days when I used to be much headier. I've got enough of that up there to realize that this is just not much in it, actually, at heart. You ask somebody to, I don't know how they produced all of this scholarship on it, because it's just not that complicated. It's actually very simple.
No, I don't think that's a frivolous framework. You know, a thing of beauty and a thing that's quite blunt and ugly, because it is true. I mean, it's sort of like, you can see it's pixels, you know. it's such a reductive and oh yeah, harsh and all consuming worldview that doesn't allow for flourishing. It doesn't really allow for that at all. It cultivates resentment, and it cultivates guilt, and it focuses on the ugliest parts of human nature. And as you say, it's not an entirely false worldview. It's just that it reduces everything down to these things that are a part of it. It's part of its temptation is in its honesty and its simplicity. And people have, you know, as we get shorter attention spans, it's more tempting to read the bumper sticker than to read the book. And so it's more easily consumable, but it lacks all of the vibrance of real life, you know, real.
It's sterile.
Yes, it is sterile. Yes.
There's a sterility to it. Very carefully packaged, very carefully structured thing. And again, the thing about therapy isn't sterile, because you never know what's going to happen. So you shouldn't be, yes, of course, you know, as somebody who uses psychoanalysis, I've got various views on how current, you know, the way somebody presents their character structure in the world today might well be related to stuff that's happened to them in the past. But, you know, I don't know the full story. I actually have to talk to them. It's like, therapy is two people coming together therapy is two people coming together who don't know what's going on. And it's two people coming together who are both experts on different things. The client is the expert on themselves, and the therapist, well, look, if they've done sufficient work, then they should be expert enough on the human condition, i.e. the world in which we live, and human nature.
Mm-hmm.
how those things interact. That's why it's partly philosophical activity, this, right? So you've got to think about, what is the nature of existence? What are we trying to get out of it? And it's like, analysts have been doing that for a long time. You had Freud, who talked about, well, it's about the avoidance of pain and the gain of pleasure. I think there's plenty in that, right? And then you get kind of someone like Frankl coming along and saying, oh, it's all that meaning. Well, there's a lot in that as well, because I think we really seek meaning. And Adler talked about kind of power. We want power, and I think that's true as well. We want power. And then the object relations theorists in Britain after the war were talking about relationship. Actually, the thing we seek most is relationship with other objects, and that's true. We seek relationship, right? And I think if you put all those four things together, then you starting to get an approximation of what a human being might be motivated by. But critical social justice doesn't do any of that. It's because it's fundamentally not psychological. It's fundamentally sociological. And that's fine. Go and do your sociology. Don't wreck my profession with it.
Yeah.
Don't come in here and tell us that you've got all the insights and that you're going to tell us how to do our jobs. Because, well, as our book shows, we've got as many insights about critical social justice as it does on us. It's a two-way thing.
Yeah, and I think that is such an important point to highlight, is that it's sociological and not psychological. And that's where it's both true and not untrue, but inappropriate for certain endeavors. It is definitely, it's based on sociological understandings that are attempted to be applied on the individual level. And so I think that there's this inherent disagreement between the individual and the collective that we keep seeing. One of the things with critical social justice is it wants to emphasize the collective, but it wants to take this aggregate, like, collective mindset and apply that to the individual level. And that's where I think the hiccups are arising. That's where the conflict really is. And that's where it's so at odds with any kind of individual search for meaning.
Absolutely. And that kind of emphasis on the collective, well, I sort of think of those being three levels. There's the individual, there's the group, and there's the universal. And the universal is a lot of the existential stuff. It's like, well, actually it doesn't matter whether you're whether you're an Inuit sort of living a kind of pre-industrial lifestyle in the Arctic Circle, or whether you're a sort of stressed professional working in the City of London. There are lots of universal human experiences: love, loss, fear, pain. All these things they're not group based. And then at the other end, there's the individual, exactly as you say, that actually at the end of the day, every time you see somebody in therapy, but not just therapy, because every time you encounter anybody in the world, in any place, at any time, you're encountering an individual, right, with their own weirdnesses, idiosyncrasies, and disappointments and joys. And the collective level, that's real. It exists, right? Because it's like, although I think something that the critical theory stuff forgets is that to a certain extent, people have their collectivities defined for them. And to a certain extent, you pick your own. You actually sort of get to decide which to emphasize. So it's like, this is a very, what's more important to me? Being a man or being British, or being white or being a psychotherapist, or coming from a working class background and then ending up growing up in a middle class background. There's all sorts of different things that different people have experiences of, and you sort of you find the commonalities that matter. Now, actually, I think let's say race as an example. I think race is a very common basis upon which people make in-group and out-group assessments, and I think critical social justice is right about that. But you don't have to make the whole of life a catastrophe as a result. It's
Mm-hmm.
like you can ameliorate that where you think it's healthy to do so. You can lean into it where you want to. I mean, if you want to go to a kind of, if you're black, you want to go to sort of a black evangelical church, why not?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Um, there's it's a kind of like people have cultural and ethnic interests.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That isn't itself intrinsically problematic unless you start to split and project and then kind of conceive of the other as very dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you start to conceive of people who are different to you as very dangerous rather than simply different, then you got some trouble, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because you forget all the commonalities you have and you only
Mm-hmm.
notice the differences that do exist. So
Mm-hmm.
I think this idea of individual, collective, and universal that's really helped me.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember where I got it from. I didn't come up with it, but I think I just really like it. And they emphasize the collective to the exclusion of these other two, but they're all real. They're all real.
I've never thought about it that way before. You said that with adding the universal in as the other, and I think that there's such a tendency right now for everything to be very polarized. We're being driven into this. I don't know if we're being driven to it. We're tending to as a we're seeing it culturally across the zeitgeist, this tendency towards polarization, and so you want to see the individual over here and the collective over here. But what you are adding in when you're adding in the universal is something that's really it changes the picture completely, and it engages both of those. So that's really interesting, and I like that a lot. And I like also your point about you can sort of choose if you want to choose identity categories, if you will. You have so many to choose from. So many. And one of the things that I sort of bristle at with this critical social justice is the concept of having identities, having intersectional identities. And they've offered you this little selection that your self is supposed to be made of, and it's their presets, and the weight of each in your composition is preset by the critical theorist. So the way that you presented that is, I think, a really nice counter, because it is true that there's going to be different weights placed on things by different individuals depending on their own experiences, interests, cultural upbringing, etc. And it's not going to be necessarily this like little subset of sociological, demographic categories that the critical theorists
Absolutely.
choose.
And I mean, you can see that in your personal life, right? People who are of different ethnicities, clients of different ethnicities. A lot of my clients, a minority of my clients are white British. A lot of my clients are either not white or they're not from the UK. Obviously, London's a very sort of mixed sort of place, but it's kind of like they don't all have one interpretation of their experience. I mean, it's so simple, it's so obvious to say, and yet somehow it needs saying. And I think racism is a real thing. Obviously, I mean, maybe there are some people who want to deny that. I don't know. I guess maybe there are, but I don't. And I think racism, the experience of racism, comes up in talking with my non-white clients. And I think it's rare for it not to come up, but it's also not the core of the work, right? So it's not
it's not first and foremost.
Well, first and foremost, everybody's experience is a kaleidoscope, right? And then what you're doing when you're a therapist is you're helping people. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think when you're sort of you're trying to help people have mentalize different possibilities as well. So it's like if somebody snubs you, well, maybe it is because they're a misogynist, or maybe it is because they're a racist. Like I don't really like the A. I'm sort of slipping into something I don't like. Maybe it's because they have misogynistic tendencies or racist tendencies. I don't think anybody's a misogynist or a racist. Every human being's a little complicated. maybe they are expressing some kind of atavistic negativity there. They might be. Or alternatively, maybe they're having a bad day. So you kind of, one of the things you do in therapy is you're always kind of and you can't come to an answer, right? It's just about being able to pursue different ideas. You're pursuing how the outer world and the inner world combine, how they kind of interact with one another. And yeah, I mean, people do sometimes feel like an outsider, and that can be because they're being treated like an outsider. Absolutely. Or it can be because they've had development experiences that lead them to feel like they're an outsider. But as we so often say in therapy, now is not then. Now is different to the past, or at least it often is. So, a lot of this stuff is covered in the book. I think it's, having had a chance now to read my colleagues' contributions, it's fantastic. It's really, there are some very intelligent people writing some very incisive stuff in this book. And you don't have to be a therapist to, if you're interested in sociocultural issues and what's going on around us in the world, and the kind of the increasing totalization of society towards politics. Suddenly everything seems about politics. It wasn't like that 20 years ago, was it? If you're interested in this stuff, this book it'll give you food for thought, and I think it will help orient you, actually. It's helping me orient myself, actually.
Well, I haven't gotten my copy yet, but I'm really looking forward to reading it. Where would you suggest people go to find it or find more information?
So there's a link on the CTA website, which hopefully might be in the bottom after our chat.
criticaltherapyantidote.org, I believe.
That's right.
Okay, and I'll put that in the notes.
That's right. And so the book is there's a page there about the book. And on that page you will see the places you can buy it, all of them. You can buy it in Kindle from various places. You can buy it in hard copy form, in this beautiful hard copy form right here, which you can get from Amazon or the Book Depository, I think, or you can get it on Kindle from, I think, Kobo and Barnes and Noble and various places.
Do you have any other recommendations that you want to mention for anybody interested in doing some more reading or more viewing?
Well, what do I kind of? I mean, CTA is a good place to look. I think New Discourses. If you really want to get to grips with what the ideology is about, rather than some of the impacts it's having, that's very useful. And of course, if you haven't got Cynical Theories, that's a useful book to purchase. There's a lot of commentary in the book for kind of further reading. I mean, it depends how kind of you can sort of bring it in or open it out, can't you? I mean, I would. I think there's some quite insightful stuff that being written by Nick in his chapter, and when he's talking about psychotherapy ideology and the new aristocracy, because I think there is a kind of a useful sociological overlay to be thought about here. And he talks about psychoanalyst Christopher Lasch, who also kind of wrote about politics and the kind of how would we put it, that I suppose politics is becoming increasingly therapeutic, and at the same time therapy is becoming increasingly politicized. But actually this doesn't serve either space very well, because they're distinct spaces.
That's very interesting.
And then political philosopher Michael Lind.
And this was Nick. Who's this author? Nick?
This is Nick Opirchel,
Okay.
who I've never met, but he's
Okay.
written a great chapter in here. So
Excellent.
well done, Nick, if you're watching.
So, are there is there anything that we didn't touch on that you want to highlight, or any final points that you think are really important to emphasize?
I think if you want to stay oriented, remember that the psychodynamic insight that everybody is self-interested is very important.
Mhm.
So remember that if somebody believes something and is trying to get you to believe something, they have a reason for that, and it is a thing that is for themselves. It might be as simple as that they get pleasure from spreading the gospel of truth, but it might be a bit more complicated than that, and it might be about competition for power is a real thing, right? And every individual needs to orient themselves around that in their own way. But also remember that not everything is about power. So here's the thing: as a therapist, I'm always torn between cynicism and naivety, I suppose.
Mm.
And I think you have to be able to hold both of those poles.
Mhm.
But don't. If somebody else is trying to make you feel guilty, don't take it on.
Mm.
We've all got enough guilt. We've all got enough guilt to feel ourselves in our lives. Don't reject guilt, because it's important information.
Mm.
But if somebody's trying to guilt trip you, then that's a different thing. That's a kind of a manipulation.
Mhm.
And also, if you think this ideology helps you, well, maybe it does in some way. What are the costs? I talk about that in my chapter. What are the costs?
Mhm.
Well, I know for a fact that if you go around life thinking you're a victim,
Mhm.
you're gonna have a life that's a hell.
Mhm.
I'll put that very clearly. It's no good.
Mhm.
You can see why people do it, because it makes them feel kind of reassured that their failings aren't their own. And sometimes they're not.
Mhm.
But again, you need to find that judicious balance of
Mhm.
understanding your capacities and your limitations.
Mhm. Mhm.
This is the sacred work of therapy, and of a life well lived, actually.
Well, I think that's brilliantly expressed, and I have found so much value in this conversation. I'm actually looking forward to listening back and taking it all in again, because I really appreciate your perspective and the way that you have framed things. I think that it's been so interesting for me, and I really appreciate you coming on and having this conversation with me.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Leslie, because it's a great opportunity to promote the book. And also, I don't do much podcasting. Maybe I'll do a bit more now, I don't know, but I don't do much. It's a lovely opportunity to actually get some of this out,
Yeah.
have a chat about it.
Yeah.
Really, really appreciate it. Really enjoyed it.
Well, awesome. Thank you. And before we go, is there anything you want to plug for yourself? Do you have a website, or I'll put
Yeah,
everything in the notes, but if you want to verbally say it for people?
Sure, I've got a website. It's www.bdharris.co.uk. You can contact me there. Well, really, I suppose if you're looking for therapy, if you think that my what I've had to say or my perspective is useful to you.
Excellent.
I'm on Twitter as well, actually, but I barely ever tweet. I think Twitter's a very negative thing, but I'm trying to tweet a bit more.
Yeah.
At a healer tweets.
A healer tweets.
A healer
Okay.
tweets.
Okay. Yeah, it's a strange thing, Twitter. Been spending a little time there recently and finding it interesting.
Yeah, it's the devil's work in some ways, I think.
Well, thank you again, Ben.
Cheers, Leslie. Thank you so much.